please join me in welcoming Randy Wootton, the CEO of Percolate.
Thank you. So before we get started, I'd just like to get a sense of who's in the room. How many marketers associated with multinational companies do we have in the room? All right. How many B2B? B2B, B2C. All right, that represents about 50% of the audience. So there's a whole bunch of folks who aren't sure whether they're B2B or B2C or they do both. But great. So what we're going to be talking a little bit about is the content bottleneck. And I wanted to just tee it up. How many people are struggling right now with creating audience-centric experiences? Trying to make sure that the content you're creating is relevant to the person you're talking to in the context with which that conversation is unfolding or the experience is unfolding. So Gartner talks about this being the biggest challenge that marketers are going to face by 2020. And what we want to tee up is, well, what is this challenge? How is it manifesting for CMOs? And what we can do about that. And to help go along, we've created an ebook. It's at your table. It's called the Content Bottleneck Challenge that we've written about, picking up the theme from Gartner and then walking through how it's developed, some of the solutions you can think about using supply chain theory, which is exciting. And then what, as marketers, how is this impacting our lives? So for some of the folks in the back who aren't able to see the slides, you can probably follow along my talk right in the book. And if you'd like to chat more, you can find us after the session. So, framing the content challenge. I actually have been very interested in the research from IBM that was alluded to earlier today about there being 3 types of marketers. Those that are aspirationals, those that are practitioners, and those that are reinventors. And when people come to a conference like this, a transformational CMO conference, the assumption is you all are reinventors. You all are trying to lead change, or you have someone on your team that's trying to lead change at an organizational level. And this is one of the things that we find in talking to CMOs and marketing leaders in the organizations we work with, is that this is a fundamental challenge. How do you restructure the system? How do you restructure the roles and responsibilities to lead to some of the higher order things like business results, improving ROI, reducing costs, or the customer experience? How do you reinvent the connections you're having with your customers? At the end of the day, we would argue that marketing's job is content. Much like when you think about manufacturing, you're building materials and turning them into components, or sales, interactions, and driving meetings. Marketing is about campaigns and contents. Content is like the atom, the campaign is like the element. How do you put those pieces together in a way that creates compelling experiences? So you say, oh, okay, that's what our job is. This is what we're trying to do. How is content a bottleneck? So let me spend a couple of minutes talking about bottlenecks. At the end of the day, bottlenecks constrain the throughput of the whole system. Think about it. Works well when you're at dinner. Last night I was down at Aunt Jake's with my family, or a big Italian restaurant, pouring the rosé, and it was great that you had a bottleneck. This is exactly where you want it. You don't want bottlenecks in the delivery of your marketing. And when you think about the process of marketing going from strategizing all the way to analyzing, the bottleneck has shifted, and this is what we outline in our ebook. Back in 1965, the bottleneck was tied mostly to the delivery. You had 3 channels. 3 channels on Sunday night during prime time with something like 16 minutes of commercials. So the constraint then was getting access to consumers through your delivery channel. As you move forward, up until 2007, this really was the biggest constraint, delivery. What happened in 2007? 2007 was the year that changed marketing forever. Look at some of the things, and you can find it in the book. The slide is there as well. You have Facebook introducing ads. Twitter becomes its own company. Marketo, marketing automation, launches its first product. At the same time, you have Apple launching the first iPhone. And you think about how we consume content, radically different. You think about Netflix and the way that they've thought about redesigning content distribution. And in the middle of this, really the most interesting dynamic was the invention of the idea of social media as a channel. And just now you have so many different touch points, so much data you have to process and make sense of. All started in 2007. Changed because of this idea of personalization. So personalization, getting the right piece of content to the right person at the right time, has been growing. Raise your hand, we all have personalization strategies, right? No? Well, then we can have another conversation, because that's a different starting point. But what we find is we spend a lot of time and money figuring out our consumer identities. A lot of who are they, first party, second party, third party data. We spent a lot of time and money. The company I was CEO of before taking over Percolate was called Rocket Fuel. And we spent an immense amount of time and money trying to make sense of data. We processed up something like 200 billion bid transactions a day. Well, here's the dirty little secret. With the increase of channels, markets, and personas, the work of marketers has gotten harder. But the resources, the number of people you have to do the job has remained flat. This has led to the content crunch. And now we have a challenge in 2020 about the development of content. And what are you all going to do as marketers? That's the conversation we're going to have. One thing is to think about what type of challenge you have. 3 dimensions: quantity, quality, and collaboration. Quantity being, I don't have enough good content. I don't know where all the content resides. Quality, ensuring you're getting the appropriate approvals. Those who work with agencies, think about the back and forth you have in terms of agencies building creative that you're accepting and approving to distribute it. And then the collaboration piece for large companies, that's why I was asking about multinationals. When you have more than enough marketers who can sit around a table and talk about the campaigns that are being launched, in that conference room, you start to have challenges about understanding what's been developed, which silo it's in, and how to get the best content out. So, at the end of the day, bottlenecks prevent you from delivering on your goals, increasing revenue, realizing cost savings, or reducing risk to the brand. So a really super simple framework to think about is you have a demand for content. Right now, you have some constraint in your capacity to build good content in a way that can have meaningful engagement with your consumers. The opportunity, if you think about the bottleneck and addressing the bottleneck, and we'll talk a little bit, it's in the book as well, is it creates opportunity to distribute that capacity. I'm not saying cut people. What I'm saying is think about where do you take that capacity in your organization and deploy it so it's more meaningful or more effective. Insights. One of the conversations we were having earlier today was about AI. AI does a lot of this work for you in terms of processing information and telling you what's working. Do you have the teams on board, data scientists, for example, who are able to take advantage of that and create the algorithms or the features that the AI needs to learn and be able to determine what is the best content to put in front of the person at the right time? So that's the framework, that's the theory. What I'd like to do is really shift to now how do CMOs think about it. And for that, I'd like to welcome up one of my good friends, Margaret Molloy, who's CMO, global CMO of Siegel and Gale, but has been recognized for many years across all of her accomplishments. Margaret and I actually got to know each other at business school almost 20 years ago. And it's been fascinating to see your journey and all the recognition and accolades you've had, Margaret. And so come on up and let's talk about the content bottleneck and how you're experiencing it in your journey.
Hello, good afternoon. We're playing to a big crowd. I like it.
Yeah, no, it works. It's always fun when you have lunch right before your session. So Margaret, you know, one of the things, clearly, wealth of experience, what do you think is your marketing superpower? What's the thing that you've been able to build over your time as a practitioner?
For me personally, it's building community and it's connecting with people. And it's interesting because the topic this afternoon is around content. And it may seem at odds with that, but in actuality, in my experience, content allows you to reinforce community. By sharing the right content in the right places, it helps you reinforce community and also scale the connectivity. So personally, I'm a connector, and content is an enabler of that connectivity.
Well, clearly you've taken advantage of the social medium in particular, and you've been doing it for a long time. When you think about building the community and connecting people in that context, what's the type of content that you're sharing in that social construct?
So it's interesting, at Siegel and Gale, we're a brand strategy, design, and experience firm. So what's very important for us is to have thought leadership. So that involves creating reports, creating interesting points of view to share with our audiences. But in listening to your framework, what struck me that's particularly inspired is from your perspective, content's a process problem.
Yeah.
That was my interpretation of your slideware.
Yep.
And that's interesting because I don't think people have reflected on it in that way. And I think it's spot on. Because at an agency, the challenge for content isn't the absence of points of view. There are plenty of smart, opinionated people. The challenge is to routinize content creation in a way that's consistent, predictable, and feeds the beast, and yet is smart and interesting. So what I find, certainly at our shop, that's the challenge. It's how do you make content creation part of the process of doing business? And certainly a dimension of that is educating people, helping people develop what I characterize as an eye for content. How do you identify good content? How do you make content creation, back to your process point, part of your workflow? And then how do you do it at scale while you still do your day job?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, Margaret, because I started Percolate about 90 days ago, as you know, and I spent time surfing and finding myself before I got my next job. And one of the things about Percolate that struck me was, why is there not a work management, project management solution already in the marketplace solving this problem? Like, it's already been done. And what you find, I think, to your point, is the work of marketing is different. The way marketers work is different. And I think sometimes what gets conflated is creatives are like, oh, I can't have any constraints to how I build content, or I come up with my idea. But what you find, I think, along a spectrum, or a variant spectrum as we describe it, there's a set of stuff that doesn't need to be creative and doesn't need to have a unique way every time you do it. For example, approvals. And so I think those types of processes are exactly what a technology can help solve, to enable the folks that are the creatives to spend more time doing creating, not time doing project management.
For sure. And you know, constraints get a bad rap. Personally, I like constraints because constraints actually, when interpreted correctly, generate better creativity. So I think constraints need to be, if you will, harnessed.
Right.
So you can harness constraints to produce good creativity, whether constraints are budget, time to market, whatever the dimension may be. So constraint isn't a hindrance to creativity. It's around having a process that does, whether it's content creation or whatever the output is, at scale in a way that's profitable.
And the funny thing about the process comment is, you remember back in business school, we read that, not goofy book, it's a great book, The Goal, an allegory about process constraints, but it was done in a class, Technology Operations Management, which is all about Six Sigma, and how do you do the Toyota way and apply it to other disciplines. And I think in the ebook that you have in front of you all, we break down the theory of constraints, how to think about it, how to identify the constraint, how to elevate the constraint, and then how to create the capacity to enable people to do more. And it really was interesting to think about wedding technology plus process to address this problem that you all are facing at agencies or at marketers. I mean, think about how easy is it for you all to find content that was created last month? How easy is it for you all, if you work at large marketing organizations, to know what was on plan, what was the brief for this quarter, and to track which campaign is happening?
I think another dimension too I observe at brands as marketers is we get bored with our own content before the audience gets bored with it. And this is a trend I observe across industry. You know, we've seen the campaign or we've seen the content internally with such frequency, we assume the audience has. So the opportunity is often to repackage, recut, and continue to perpetuate. I think another, I don't like the word failure, but another opportunity for improvement we see is brands aren't always clear on what their purpose is. So where does it begin? You know, we talk about content and it's a process, but the beginning is really understanding as a company, what is your purpose? Meaning, why do you exist in the world? And
it's like an existential crisis.
But you need to have clarity on that before you start willy-nilly creating content.
Right.
So I would suggest that's the first part. Be clear on your purpose, meaning why do you exist? Be clear on your positioning. How do you present yourself to the world? Be clear on your values. That's how you go to market. And coincidentally, Mr. Siegel is going to come up a little later after us, and he's going to talk about voice. And those are all essential components of content, because I think we want to be sure that we're creating quality content.
And I think that's the challenge, is people are with fewer resources to feed the beast. They're just trying to generate stuff. Right? And there isn't this time to really think about quality. It's hard to have quantity and quality without some sort of system of record that you can use to know what's happening, have simplified processes. So on that front, when you've talked to brands, one of the things you guys espouse is around simple. What is simple? When I walked in to meet with you and saw it on the wall, I was like, wow, that's really it's a powerful term. It's in some ways very simple. At the same time, it's very nuanced, and there's these layers to it. And so how do you find that playing out for brands when you're describing this idea of understanding their purpose and how to develop all the way to the voice? Like, what does that manifest?
Yeah. Well, for us, simplicity happens at the intersection of clarity and surprise. So if you just have communications that are clear, that's good, but it can be very boring. You need the communications, the brand, the touch points to have that little aha moment. So it's that balance of being fresh and clear.
And so how do you do that at scale? Because that's the big challenge, right? Again, in this day and age, we know 1 billion people as individual snowflakes. We're capturing all their data. We know which device they're on. We know where they are in their day. I live in San Francisco. I'm either watching the Raiders on the couch with my boys, or I'm on BART going to work. I'm almost different people. The research shows that I'm a different person in those different moments of influence. So how do you create, how do you do that at scale in terms of creating content that can surprise? Because that feels like a lot of work to get that original idea and then to be able to do it at almost a personalized level.
Well, certainly that's the intent, and I don't purport to have the magic bullet. But what I would observe is there are a number of mindsets that set brands apart, I think, who do this well from others who do it less well. And I'll try to keep it within the frame of content. One difference is, and think about this, there are brands who really think about the customer journey as path to purchase. And the intent is, be it creating content or other engagement, that's about capturing the customer and consummating the transaction. Then there are brands who, in my view, have a more enlightened perspective because they think about the customer experience from a much broader aperture. They think about, sure, there's the path to purchase, but they don't think in terms of buyers. They think in terms of users. So if you begin and think about your customers, that journey, the moment of truth, not ending when they give their credit card, but actually using the product, that is a meaningful difference in frame. And it has meaningful content implications. So for example, you create content that's geared at making sure somebody uses the product. So maybe it's education and orientation, as opposed to just using the product. Brands who care about purchase, frankly, they care about awards at Cannes, where none of us are. Brands who care about customer experience want that rating. They want the 5-star rating on the system. Brands who care about purchase are looking at ad-based metrics, whereas brands who care about usage are really focused on engagement metrics. The brands who care about purchase are looking, as I say, at those moments of truth from consideration and awareness to the transaction, but others are looking at engagement and referral. So I think that's the mindset. And if you peel it back from a content standpoint, it is meaningful distinctions around the kinds of content they're creating because it's serving a different purpose.
Right, so it proliferates the problem in some ways, is how do you create enough content? I think, to your point, when you think about B2C versus B2B marketers, for example, a lot of them are being held accountable for pipeline generation.
Yeah.
Right, 40% of the pipe, B2B marketers having to drive it. It was interesting, I was at a Serious Decisions conference recently doing this talk, and all the vendors, other than 3, were about lead qualification, demand gen, ABM technologies, and attributions. And why is that? It's because marketers are being held accountable for the pipeline. But I think it takes away from this opportunity to think about how do you create the experience. So are there brands that you think are doing this really well on the B2B side as well as the B2C side?
Certainly, but I think even in B2B, if you look at the business model, like let's step back for a moment from just the pure revenue creation and step back and look at the business models. So many, particularly in tech, business models now are predicated on subscription-based models, right? So back in the day when you and I were in tech, Randy, it was selling licensed software. And that was a lucrative business, and maybe there was an ongoing annuity on the back of it.
The maintenance support contract.
Right, which was a small percentage of the total transaction.
Yeah.
Today, so many tech companies are predicated on ongoing subscription. Some even begin with a freemium model, and they want you to upgrade. So I think that actually further supports the theory that the mindset needs to be beyond acquisition. And of course, attribution is an important dimension of that, but it needs to move from acquisition to retention to experience.
In fact, that's one of the things. So I've been in technology for 20 years, specifically internet technology, and support marketers like you. But I do think what you find with software companies in particular is they fail post-implementation.
Yeah.
So the whole function around customer success and how do you encourage adoption and ensure usage, and content being a customer loyalty marketing venue as much it is as customer acquisition, super important to support the business models, which all VCs want to see. They want to see what's your subscription revenue, what's your growth, what are your usage metrics, and then similarly on the B2C side, what's your conversion rate for consumers coming to your websites.
That's right, and loyalty. I mean, loyalty is interesting, isn't it? And what role content can play in generating loyalty. I look to, I look in perhaps strange places when I look at companies who do this well. I often look at fashion and retail because I think those sectors are undergoing so much disruption. Their behaviors and what they're experiencing is a precursor to what will happen in other sectors. So these may be bizarre examples, but I look at Adidas, and any of you know that tracksuit? The tracksuit's been around 50 years. And that tracksuit is standing the test of time. And yet you look at that brand and you see the partnerships they've created. I observe the content they've created. And I think they are very enlightened in a world where we're all such fickle customers of content. And more importantly, fickle customers of fashion.
And I think a couple of components on that. Adidas is a customer of Percolate. And what's interesting is the way they think about content. It's not, and this I think is the broader definition. What does content mean? Is it a blog? Well, in 2007 it was. Is it the website experience? Today it represents long, short form video. It represents white papers, or what represents anything that you're doing in terms of creation, where you're allocating resources to build stuff. And I think Adidas in particular, they've done a really interesting set of work across 50 regional markets, trying to coordinate that experience. Because to your point, Margaret, I think part of this is people resonating with the brand at the brand values level and understanding their voice, as Mr. Siegel is going to talk a little bit more, and having that be true and authentic, but then manifest in the campaigns that they're executing.
I think that's right. So knowing your purpose is a very powerful filter. If I could draw on another, perhaps underappreciated example, it's CVS. Mm-hmm. So many of us may know CVS as the corner drugstore. It's actually a Fortune 11 company. And they, I believe, began in the right place. They recently re-articulated their purpose as helping people on a path to better health. Now, that's an interesting purpose. That's not saying, we'll get you some Advil and we'll get some meds when you need them. And I think that purpose empowers them to innovate at such a richer level. But it also mandates that they be courageous and bold. And one of the bold things they did a couple of years ago is you may know this, they took tobacco out of the stores. Well, the implication of that was $2 billion of revenue. And that was a bold decision because not only was that on brand from a purpose standpoint, it forced them to be innovative. They were, in effect, disrupting themselves. So now they have to fill $2 billion of revenue to meet their Wall Street demands. So it's really interesting that they're forcing that their behaviors align with their purpose. And now, lo and behold, the Aetna potential merger. Again, because they articulated a purpose that permissioned them to, that's totally online. A few years back, would we have imagined the CVS combination Aetna being sensible? Perhaps not. So it's interesting to look at the linkage between purpose, living the purpose, and having the audacity to make sure all of your actions align with it, then creating the content and the business relations that make sure that's a congruent conversation.
And then the other thing with the retail footprint is creating a new experience in the retail.
Absolutely.
And what's going to happen to people not just going to get their pharmacy drugs. One that I just bumped into recently, which I think similar idea of reconfiguring how they're thinking about creating experiences, is AT&T. I don't know if you guys been to some of their flagship stores, but they've started the sponsorship with Westworld, where you can go in and use the VR goggles and go in and pick the white hat or black hat. And I won't tell you which one I picked, but it really is this unreal experience where you're in there having this Westworld experience in an AT&T store. And you're like, well, why is this happening? Well, AT&T owns DirecTV. Yeah. The number one moneymaker for DirecTV is HBO. So the way that they promote the consumption of content is by creating this experience. And the thing I think is fabulous about it is they're reimagining what is the experience of the consumer in their store. I'm not just going in there to buy the phone. I'm going in with my boys to have this VR experience in a very different way.
And an adjacent one is Sephora. Sephora is, in my mind, a marvelous content marketer. They also understand that distinction between acquisition and usage. If you look at their content, so much of that content is generated to motivate people to use the product.
Yeah.
Contrast that with their competitor, the beauty counter in the department store. So what's the beauty counter's MO? They give us free samples. What is Sephora doing? They're creating content that's video-oriented. They have a nice balance between how they work with influencers and how they use their own employees. They understand micro-influencers at a very smart level. They have a tremendously savvy integration of digital and the store presence. So that's a brand in a category that's under attack, retail, that is still getting people into the stores. And their rewards program, another very powerful asset. Their rewards program is not predicated on getting you points to get free stuff. No, it's trying to get you access before others to product. So they understand the driver of their customer as an insider, the beauty insider, who wants access to the new lipstick before everyone else. So it's not about cutting costs by giving coupons.
And it's a way to re-envision their business model competing with Amazon.
Right.
So one of the things I've been impressed by, Margaret, throughout your career is just this wearing Irish. And it just has been very inspiring to see what you've done with it and to follow you on the social media landscape. And what I thought would be interesting to close off our session was, we have a bunch of marketers in the room, and as we were chatting is, why did you do that? It seems like a whole heck of a lot of work. And I mean, I get it, you're from Ireland, you want to promote design, but there were some other dimensions to it that you were thinking about.
Certainly. So wearing Irish is, if you will, a social media movement that I started about 2 years ago as a hashtag. Fast forward to today, and there's a platform, we have a significant number of events, and the opportunity I identified specifically was to tell the world the story of Irish fashion design and to provide the designers with access and exposure to new markets. So despite Ireland's prowess as a storyteller, I identified an untold story. No one knows that there are world-class fashion designers in Ireland. So that's what it is. It's certainly a very nice opportunity for me personally to give back. But as you've asked the question, as I reflect on it from a marketer standpoint, I would make a few points on how it essentially, albeit perhaps counterintuitively, actually helps Siegel and Gale, which is my day job. And the first is, it's a lab. I believe every marketer needs their lab. You need a place where you can get your fingers dirty, that's adjacent to your business, but maybe do things that are not on point. So for example, some of the activities I engage in wearing Irish are experimental that may not be appropriate for Siegel and Gale. But in that process of trying to build the Wearing Irish brand, I develop a level of empathy with everyone here who are trying to build brands that I would never have.
So it's practicing your craft as a marketer.
Number
one.
And
the more senior you get, you have less opportunities to do that because you're reviewing stuff versus doing stuff.
Exactly. So that's number one. And number two is, it's interesting how we think about brands and personas. You know, if you're in a professional services organization or a technology organization where you're selling to marketers or to others, I think people, and this goes full circle to my connection point at the beginning, don't underestimate the importance of the likability of your brand. If the people on the front lines are doing interesting things that makes a brand more likable, that has immeasurable power. So by my doing this, by my, frankly, being vulnerable and going out there and trying to do something, the reverberating positive impact on Siegel and Gale is significant because it's a conversation starter and it improves the likability of our brand.
And it's coming from a very authentic place with a genuine purpose. And so it just is this wonderful experiment around a brand that you're building with a large community. So congratulations, Margaret, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.